All right, it looks like people entering are slowing down, so I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Hotchkiss. Welcome. I'm a PhD student in the College of Natural Resources and the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management. I'm also a Global Change Fellow through the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is a program funded through the USGS and housed here at NC State. And the goal of the program is to support students interested in climate science and multidisciplinary research.
Hi everyone, I'm Alexandria Nelson. I'm a Global Change Fellow and a PhD student in the NCSU Department of Applied Ecology. And welcome to our third Global Change Fellow seminar of the academic year. This webinar will help participants understand why framing matters and gain exposure to tested framing language. We will cover why we need to talk about climate change and cover the elements of an impactful climate story.
Our speaker today is Adam Ratner, who is subbing for Kayla McCurry. And he is the Associate Director of the Conservation Education at the Marine Mammal Center, a global leader in marine mammal rehabilitation and conservation and the world's largest marine mammal hospital. He's also a member of the board of directors for the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation, NNOCCI. He'll tell you more about that. Just some quick housekeeping. This session is being recorded. Please keep yourself muted. And if you have any questions, please add them to the chat box. There will be about 15 minutes or so at the end. We'll try and gather the questions that are posted in the chat box. And thank you very much for your attention. I will now turn it over to Adam.
Thank you so much, Courtney, Alex. It's a pleasure to meet all of you. Very excited about being here. Sorry for a little bit of the bait and switch on the speaker with Kayla having to take a step back. But as you heard, I've been part of the board of directors for the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation, or NNOCCI, for around 7 years at this point. I'm based out of the San Francisco Bay Area at the Marine Mammal Center, which is a hospital for seals, sea lions, whales, dolphins, and a great place if you want to waste around 10 hours of your life looking at cute pictures of seals and sea lions on YouTube and Facebook. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Please, throughout the entire session, if you have questions, use the chat box. I'll rely on Alex and Courtney just to help kind of guide any participation happening in the chat box. And then we'll save some time at the end for questions as well. I'm just curious, by kind of show of hands or reactions, how many people have heard of NNOCCI before in this group, or is this completely novel to all of you? So just a quick kind of show of hands, or using the thumbs up or reactions if you don't have your video on, just to have a sense. Looks like it's pretty new to most people. Okay, excellent. Well, let's go ahead and jump into it then. So what I want to try and do with all of you today is kind of walk through a few different elements of how we tell the story of climate science, because obviously there's amazing climate science out there. A lot of you are doing some of that work on the ground. There's also a science to how we talk about it, though, and that's where some of the experience that the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation might be able to support your work. So here's what we're going to do. We'll start with just kind of setting the landscape. What is it about the climate story that we need to know, and why is it important to maybe think about the way we're telling that story? We'll then walk through the different parts of the climate story, and I'll finish with talking about kind of how can you stay connected. If this is something that resonates with you, what are ways to learn more, since we're just going to scratch the surface here. But let's start with the landscape. So what is happening around public perceptions, around discourse for climate science right now? So latest stats come from around 6 months ago, the Yale Program for Climate Change Communication, a fantastic resource looking at kind of public opinion polls around the country. And right now, we're at one of the highest levels that they've recorded in the last 20 years in terms of belief in climate change. So 76% of people in the US think climate change is happening now. Obviously, we would love that number to be higher, but I will share, I saw a study not too long ago that showed around 9% of the US believes that chocolate milk only comes from brown cows. So at a certain point, we're just not going to get to 100%. There really is only around 10% that are those adamant kind of deniers or skeptics of climate change. They have a louder voice than you might think, but overwhelmingly, most people in the US think climate is happening right now. Now, we can compare that, though, to a stat that shows that only 61% of people talk about climate change, rarely or ever. So even though people believe climate is happening right now, there's essentially a spiral of silence that's happening. People just aren't bringing it up. And what that results in is only around 1 in 4 people hear about climate change from someone they know once a month or more, which is stunning. I think for so many of us in this field, we hear about climate change 20 times a day. But for most people in the US, it's just not part of the conversation. And if you're not hearing about it, you may not realize other people care about it or believe in it. So you start to self-silence. What we need to do is we need to break that spiral of silence. We need to really normalize conversations, normalize the feelings that go with climate change so that people can really have productive conversations as we move forward. I'll also say it's not just talking about climate change, but it's how we talk about it. We found that when we talk about climate change in a context of hope, we actually see people more willing to talk about it again. People, for the most part, don't want to dwell on the bad things as much. So more hopeful individuals are more likely to talk about it, more likely to act and support policies on it as well. And by people talking about it, it actually creates this ethos, this sense of belief and acceptance in the climate science. So not only do we want to talk about climate change, we want to talk about it in a way that promotes healthy dialogue and action along the way. So this is where NNOCCI comes in, the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation. So this is an organization and a network that spans across the entire country. We've got over 250 organizations represented, around 500 trainers of this material, and in 38 states and growing. And really, this is about sharing a common language. This is about pooling resources, knowing that we're all trying to achieve this kind of helpful change around conversations on climate. And we've been able to scale it to have enormous impact. These are organizations ranging from state and national parks to the biggest zoos and aquariums around the country, to a lot of the different kind of informal science and community-based organizations. Across all of our groups, we're reaching tens of millions of people every single year with tested messages around climate change communication. I'm not going to bother reading kind of our mission statement, but you see the big kind of goal that we're trying to do, what we are working towards as this network of climate communicators and climate scientists trying to change the national conversation. So I'll give you just a moment to take a look at that. I'll call out just those last 3 things. We want the conversation to be more positive. We want it to be civic-minded and solutions-focused. And over the last 12 years that we've been working, we've actually been able to evaluate the impact of these communication tactics, and we've seen a shift in the national discourse around climate towards these things. There is still a lot more room to go, but we've been able to see that this is a tested model, and we've got research to back that up. Our system is relatively simple, actually, when you think about it. We took the best climate scientists out there and all the latest climate science, but we realized that we couldn't just tell people the climate science. This kind of knowledge deficit model isn't really the way to get to behavior change. Just telling people the facts won't necessarily make them change their minds. So what we did is we took that best climate science and we paired them up with social psychologists and social scientists. And we scientifically tested the language use of how we talk about that climate science. And we found some techniques are actually way more impactful than others. We then figured out how to get this out, paired them with educators, identified these kind of nodes. What are the organizations that have trusted messengers and huge audiences? And we started to produce a whole series of trainings to really empower the climate communicators to change the story. And it's worked. It's worked on two fronts. We've seen a change in the climate communicators. So through this train the trainer program, the scientists, the communicators, the educators, their knowledge of climate science has increased. Their sense of community, that emotional and social support that's just so necessary in this field, has grown. Their confidence has grown as well. And that's led to them being more impactful messengers. And then the people hearing those messages have a better understanding of climate science, an improved sense of hope, and are more likely to take action. Obviously, the ultimate goal in this entire equation. So that's the brief story of kind of what NNOCCI is. What I want to do with you for kind of the rest of the time is walk through some of the key elements of how we got this science, what are some of the things we found, and what are some practical applications that we can use. And of course, throughout this, use the chat box, add in questions, and we'll save some time at the end as well. But where we started with all of this is, to be perfectly honest, a little bit of mind reading. We needed to figure out with our audience, what were the things that they were thinking about when climate change came to mind? What were their pre-existing beliefs or misconceptions around this? Because there's always things happening in your head. How do we help steer the conversations in a productive model? And we teamed up with a group called Frameworks Institute for a lot of this research. And I'll share some links and happy to put additional resources in the chat box at the end. But I want to start with just a little bit of an experiment with all of you to get a sense of where this is going. So what we want to try and do is figure out what comes to mind when people hear different terms. And there's a scientific way to do this. There's also an unscientific way to do this. I'm going to do the unscientific way with you. So if you go to Google, and you go to Google Images and you type in ocean, these are the top 30 images or so that pop up. Google is designed to try and read our minds. When we type something into Google, it has to figure out what are we hoping to get in that result. And it starts to actually queue up some interesting things about what are the public perceptions, the beliefs around different things. So what I ask from all of you is take a look at these 30 pictures of what happens when we put in ocean to Google. What do you notice? Type into the chat box. What are things that are coming to mind as you see all these pictures? And Courtney or Alex, I might ask for your support in just reading off some of the things that are coming through the chat box here. So what are things that these pictures have in common? What are the trends?
Clean, clear, blue, pristine.
Sunlight, warm water, blue
I love how you
waves.
can figure out warm water from this. Okay, perfect. Anything else? I've heard clean, pristine, blue. Anything else that's coming through?
Ben mentioned no people or organisms, really,
Okay.
in many of them.
Yep, so it's vast, clearly, but it's also kind of empty. Very few of these have pictures of any life in it. When they do, it's the charismatic megafauna, like the whales and the turtles. Obviously, at a hospital for marine mammals, I can't be upset that they're the ones that get the attention. But even in so many of these, it's just at the surface. We're not even seeing what's underneath those waves. Now, obviously, there's a more scientific way to do this, and that's what I'll talk about. But this is a little bit enlightening, hopefully, where we think about this is what comes to mind when people think of the ocean. And there are good elements to that, and there are some maybe tricky or dangerous elements that come to that. On the good side, this is awe-inspiring, if you ask me. This kind of big, vast blue ocean. It's pristine. It's beautiful. You have this idea of sunlight and kind of warmth that comes through these pictures. That can inspire a sense of wonder. That can inspire a connection and a desire to do more with it or connect with it. But I'd also argue, if this is what comes to mind, pristine, clean, vast, no life to be kind of found, why does the ocean need help right now? I spend most of my time talking about climate change and ocean trash and overfishing. But if this is what comes to mind when we think of the ocean, I don't see trash. I see a pretty beautiful environment that's in pristine condition. So you could have these kind of mental blocks that might form depending on what's in people's heads. There are good elements, there are bad elements, but knowing what those elements are allow you to steer the conversation in a productive way. So that's how we get to, well, what happens if we think about this from a climate change perspective? And I'm not going to show you the images that pop up on Google Images. It might just make you sad, I'll be honest. So I'm going to give you a moment to just read the cute comics, because the NNOCCI team has spent probably more time than needed trying to find cute comics around climate change. But what I would love for you to do is head back into the chat box. What word or words come to mind when you hear the term climate change? Jot them down in the chat box. If Alex or Courtney, you can kind of do the same thing, read off what comes through for me.
Seems like a lot of unknown,
Interesting. Okay.
some worry.
Worry.
Kind of, yeah, kind of sad.
Hmm.
Or yeah, the sense of urgency.
Okay. Interesting. You've got kind of two different sides of a coin. You've got unknown and you've got urgency. Sometimes those don't go hand in hand. What else?
Polar bears.
Yeah, specific things, sea level rise.
Someone's
Heat.
always got to put polar bears. I know I queue it up. I set you up for that with the picture. All right. Anything else that's coming through? I want to make sure we capture all of your great ideas and thoughts.
Extreme weather.
Okay. Extreme weather. So there have been a bunch of different studies on this. I'll kind of walk through some of the things that we've been able to take from it. But for many, many years, when groups like the Yale Program on Climate Change were doing this, what comes to mind when you think of climate change? The answer was actually pretty consistent for around the first 15 years of that study. And the answer was, in fact, polar bears. Again, I work at a marine mammal hospital. Sure, I'll take it. But I think it speaks to why maybe we haven't been as impactful in changing the conversation on climate change. Is if what comes to mind is polar bears, that's distant. That's not in my neighborhood. Maybe I've got other things I have to worry about, like having food on the table or a roof on the house for the kids, whatever it might be. It doesn't give that sense of relevancy, connection, maybe urgency. And it worked to get everyone who cared about polar bears on board. And then it kind of started to fall short. It was only in the last 3-4 years in that same study where all of a sudden people started saying different things. Right now, the thing that comes to mind the most, unfortunately, extreme weather events. It's taking disasters to get this really into the lexicon. More people are hearing about it, but it also increases that sense of urgency, obviously, as well. So what NNOCCI and the social scientists and other groups have been doing is trying to figure out, where are people's minds on this? What are some of those productive things? What are some of the ones that are maybe less productive? And what we developed was essentially a mental map. We refer to it as the swamp, that helped map where people's minds are. This was a representative study across kind of all demographics, age, gender, socioeconomic status, you name it, around the country. There is a lot on this slide. So please don't feel like you need to memorize this. I am happy to send a copy of slides out afterwards. But basically, when thinking about oceans and climate change, we were able to break things into around 7 buckets. We've got a little bit of a stoplight system here. So at the top of each category, the green are things we identified were productive mental models, so things that set people up for kind of success in understanding what the problem is, why it's important to take action. The yellows proceed with caution. They could work, but they could lead people down a path that becomes a little bit more tenuous. And then the reds are things that honestly have led to less productive conversations. It sets people up to take the wrong solutions as an action, or not really understanding why this is important. And some of these things have popped up a little bit in just what you shared. So some of you were sharing things around kind of unknowns. Well, that could be in this kind of red under science up at the top, a new study every week. There's more and more coming out all the time. while for some of us in the scientific field, that's really exciting. We're always learning more. For others, it could create this sense of we don't really know what's happening. You keep getting new things, like what's the real story, and set people up for that kind of skeptic side of things. We see a lot of people confusing climate and weather, for example, in the climate change thing, kind of tied in with, oops, it looks like we've got someone maybe annotating a little bit on there. We see people when they think about the polar bears, we get into this melting ice, and obviously a huge issue when it comes to climate change impacts. It's in the yellow because maybe that's not as relevant to my neighborhood. I don't have that sense of connection to it. So we'll kind of walk through some of these different things, but this is some of the basis of where we started developing some tools. Let's figure out what comes to mind for people. What are the productive mental models? What are the lesser productive models? And let's steer people towards the things that are more productive. So what that translates to then is this idea of strategic framing. So a research-based communication practice that really what we're trying to do is bridge the gap of what the scientists know. There are still things we're learning about climate science. We know what the problem is. We know what the solutions are. The public is not quite there yet. So let's bridge that. Let's find ways to simplify this science. Climate change is complicated. It takes people PhD kind of research to just get a small piece of some of the climate story. But let's simplify it. Let's create sticky messages that people can talk about and share with others. Let's make sure we insert people into this story, find a way for them to see themselves as the hero. And that will hopefully give them hope as well. So we're going to break our core story down into 3 pieces. Why does this matter? How does it work? And how do we improve the situation? And each time we talk about climate change, we want to include all 3 of these pieces. One of my biggest pet peeves is when we think about so much around climate communications, whether it's in the media or anything else, we hear a lot about it's bad. And we have 12 years or whatever it might be to take action. But we don't really spell out some of those actions a lot of the time. We just scare people to death and think that that's going to make them identify what the solution might be. Sometimes we skip that relevancy part right at the very beginning and it gets lost. We have a finite pool of worry these days. How do we get people to see climate change as something that is important to them, that is relevant to them, so that they then choose to take action? So let's start with the why here. And this really comes down to using tested values. How do we set up the conversation with people so that they are immediately kind of on board in an agreement? Hey, we're coming from the same place. We have this shared ethos that I'm not trying to convince you about something new. You already believe this. You already hold this sense of value. Let's lean into that. The problem is that I'm not sure about all of you, but I'm extraordinarily passionate about the environment and animals and climate. The things I value and care about may not be the same things others do. So we need to go back to some of the research, and we did specific testing on people around the country, trying to understand what values really resonate with people for climate change across political parties and demographics of where geographically you are in the country. And we were able to identify 2 specific values that were actually more helpful in leading people to believe in climate change and to act on behalf of it. The first is the idea of protection. We have a duty to safeguard the well-being of people and places. It's not particularly kind of breathtaking that this is something that came up. People have been using this a lot. What we found is that this is one of the most effective ways to start conversations and embed into conversations when talking about climate change. And there are elements of this that we were able to test with specific language. So here are some of those things that really resonated across the American and Canadian public when we were talking about climate change. This opened the door to deeper conversations. So showing concern for others, stepping in to ensure people's safety and well-being, eliminating, reducing risks. Those resonate with people. they may not agree with all the tactics that come next for how to do this. There's not a way to kind of brainwash people into immediately jumping on board. But this gave us the opportunity. We came from a kind of consensus place and allowed us to have a conversation that was really productive. The other, responsible management. Protection is a little bit more the here and now. Responsible management is how do we take action moving forward. So taking common sense steps is in the interest of future generations. And you can see similar kind of talking points that went along with this. Bringing protection, responsible management into the conversation early and often was one of the most helpful things when we were testing all of our climate communications. We'll get to how we actually talk about climate change, but starting here means that you don't have that door shut in your face, or you don't start immediately falling into this kind of why should I care? How is this important? These are value systems that people in the US and Canada at large hold. So let's touch those value systems so that they realize, oh, this is something I should care about because I care about responsible management and protecting people. So what does this look like in kind of real life? I've added just 2 simple sentences for how we might start. Anything ranging from a blog post or a website to a piece of exhibit signage at a museum to maybe the beginning of a presentation that we give to any audience, to just have people set the stage for why what I'm about to talk about is important. And I'm pretty sure you're going to agree with me right off the bat, which gives me kind of a little bit of a step up as we start to get into the meat of then what is climate change and why should you be doing something about it. So I'll give you just another moment to read over these 2 things. And again, happy to share slides and provide additional research. I'm not going to get into all of the nuance of the studies. All of it is open access. So happy to share some of that as well and answer questions for you. All right, so this is the first piece. Now let's think about the next piece. So why does this matter? Let's use values, particularly protection, responsible management. Now comes a little bit of the tougher part. How do we explain the issue of climate change? We could take entire curriculums that are multi-year and just scratch the surface. But in most of our communications, we have maybe 60 seconds or less to explain the basic mechanism of climate change. And we need it to be something that people can remember, because if they can't remember it, they're less likely to then talk about it and get into that spiral of silence again. So what we've tried to do is a few different pieces. We need to set people up for success. If they don't understand the problem, they may not understand how to solve the problem. And we've seen this a lot in some of the research that shows that what can you do to help climate change? A lot of people say things like recycling. There's nothing inherently wrong with recycling. Don't get me wrong. Please recycle if you can. I hope I'm not bursting anyone's bubble here, but if everyone starts recycling, we are still not solving climate change. But that is far and away one of the most common solutions that people think of when they think of climate change. It's this idea of material pollution rather than things like heat trapping gases. And it's as simple as put it in this bin rather than this bin. So it's just not allowing us to move the needle where we need to. Let's set up our communications. Yeah.
Sorry, I have a quick question from Dea. She asked if the survey included people under 18.
It did not. That was just an IRB thing. So all of this was tested with adults. What I can share though is we've used this with all ages at this point, and have good evaluated data from various zoos, aquariums, museums, parks that worked on youth. But the original research was only done on 18 and older just because of the research criteria and things along those lines. Great question though. Anything else from the chat box before we go too much farther though?
Not yet.
Okay, perfect. All right, so we've got kind of this idea of we need to connect the dots for people. We also want to do it in a way that kind of puts people at the center of it. How do they fit into this? So that way, if they hear about the cause and maybe the impact, they can already start thinking about solutions before we start talking about them. That's the kind of secret sauce. That's how we can put together a really, really good story. So the researchers kind of went to the drawing board and said, all right, how do we make this really abstract and somewhat complex issue concrete and sticky? And many of you have probably heard of a particular metaphor that's been used for decades at this point, the greenhouse gas effect. People have been doing that. It's in all the textbooks. You hear it in the news today. So they started and said, okay, well, is that an effective metaphor for communicating the science of climate change? Spoiler alert, not really. And that's for a couple reasons. The first is that a lot of people these days, unfortunately, don't know what a greenhouse does and how it works. It's a different issue for a different day, but the simple story is if you're using a metaphor in terms that people don't understand, they're not going to understand the issue that you're trying to reference. The other piece that I think was more interesting to me originally when I saw it was when you think about it, is a greenhouse a good or a bad thing? Kind of a good thing. We need greenhouses. A lot of the food we eat and depend on comes from greenhouses. So psychologically, it actually sets us up for a little bit of failure in terms of, well, why is this a problem that we have this greenhouse gas effect? So we decided to test some different metaphors. I'm not going to be able to get into all of them today, but we do have lots of resources I can share. We have 4 tested metaphors in particular that we have found. Again, this was tested with adults, and I'll explain if you want to talk with youth how we'll change it. But these have been shown to help people understand the science of climate change, be more willing to talk about climate change, and set them up to better understand the solutions to climate change. Here are those 4 metaphors. The heat trapping blanket, regular versus rampant carbon dioxide, climate's heart, and osteoporosis of the sea. I, for sake of time, am not going to get into some of these. Osteoporosis of the sea, just don't use it with kids. It's not intended for kids, but it does work when you're talking to adults around ocean acidification. Regular versus rampant carbon dioxide. This kind of speaks to, we've got the natural carbon cycle, photosynthesis, respiration. You also have all of these fossil fuels that we're burning, like coal, oil, and methane gas, that are throwing things out of whack. We need to address the rampant sources of carbon dioxide. Again, this is one works better with adults just because of the word choice for rampant, but we did find that this particular word pairing, regular versus rampant, was very sticky. It was very memorable. So it helped with that alliteration as people were talking about this days, weeks, and months later. Climate's heart speaks to how the ocean really serves as the circulatory system for the planet's climate, helping to move heat and moisture around the world. And this is why we see some places getting warmer, while other places might get wetter, and how we can speak to the same way we take preventative actions to protect our heart, exercise, regular checkups, preventative maintenance. We should be taking action to help protect the climate's heart as well. Now, the heat trapping blanket's the one I want to focus on, though. This is the original. This is one that we have been able to track. This was developed by NNOCCI and the Frameworks Institute around 12 years ago. And we've been able to see it moving through the national conversation on climate change. You will now see this on news articles. You will see this in journals. You will see this across the board. And we found that this is really a better metaphor than the greenhouse gas effect. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put up a slide next, and I'm just going to own it's a terrible PowerPoint slide. It is a block of text. It'll be jarring, I promise you. What I wanted to do is just give you a script or a text that shows how we use this. And then I'll have you read it. You can comment in the chat box, and then we'll break it down a little bit. But because I've been in that place before with bad PowerPoint slides, just wanted to call it out. Here we go. So I'm not going to read this fully out loud to you. Please just take a moment. This is a little California-centric. Apologies. This is what happens with kind of 5 minutes before jumping in, but gives you a little bit of how we use the heat trapping blanket metaphor, and then talk about a particular element of climate kind of science and impacts, in this case, wildfires. So take a look. What I would love is after you finish reading in the chat box, jot down things that are resonating with you. Is there something about this kind of quick story that stands out that you really like? I'm also open. Are there things that are not working for you in this? Let me know your thoughts in the chat box. And if anything comes through, again, Courtney, Alex, if you wouldn't mind, my guess it'll take just a minute for people to actually read this 2-paragraph block, though. So put in the chat box, are there things that stand out to you that you really like? Are there things that maybe aren't working? What's resonating with you as you read this? And you can see that heat trapping blanket metaphor really being those first 2 sentences. And Alex, Courtney, if you wouldn't mind reading out anything that's coming through the chat box for me.
Yeah, there was for the previous one about the climate hearts metaphor. And then for this passage, the percentage of change to human caused climate change is useful.
Okay.
Text is reducing the psychological distance, making climate change local and current and human caused, the anthropogenic.
Yeah, so really focusing on the human piece.
Cause and effect up front and center.
Seems to be a
Excellent.
pattern of connecting things to something we can relate to personally.
Excellent. So every climate story is going to be different, obviously. And kind of North Carolina, sea level rise, obviously huge. Maybe extreme weather events with hurricanes. You have the science, and if you don't, there are great resources out there to get some of these things, like the numbers you see in the bottom half of this. So you can make this your own, but I want to call out a few elements here, kind of the special pieces to think about when you're crafting your story. So let's start with the fact that we would originally start with our value up at the very top. So before we even get to this, we'd have something about protection and responsible management, like I showed you on the previous slide. Then what we want to do is we want to start big. We want to make sure people understand what is causing this. And we're going to tie it back to fossil fuels, and not just saying fossil fuels, defining fossil fuels, because again, people don't know that much about this, unfortunately. So actually spelling out coal, oil, methane gas helps people immediately then start to queue up in their head, okay, if I want to solve this, I need to think about things like coal, oil, and methane gas. The carbon dioxide builds up in the atmosphere, acts like this heat trapping blanket, warms the air, the land, and the sea. This metaphor works for all ages. And even the really young kids know if you have too much blanket, you get too hot and uncomfortable. So the solution is, let's get rid of some of that blanket. And what's causing it? The fossil fuels like coal, oil, and methane gas. And then we want to really set up what's at stake. This is where we're going to customize it. Don't rely too much on numbers. 1, 2 numbers, that's all that people can remember. Thinking about ways that we tie this in, bringing the concept of fairness in some case. How do we help those that are underserved or most marginalized can be really helpful in a lot of audiences. Pick and choose what in your community will really stand out and dive into it. But no, you have to do it in usually only 1, 2, or 3 sentences in a lot of cases. The farther you get, the less likely people are going to be able to pull out some of those things. So we have to be mindful and succinct, even though there's mountains of data, there's mountains of stories that we can get to. All right. So let's start to wrap this up a little bit. We've got why is it important? How does it work? We can't leave people, though, without talking about what can they do about it. Because even if we set them up with things like coal, oil, and methane gas, they might not immediately know what to do. So again, a lot of time looking at memes, comics, and other things. So I'll give you a quick moment to think about with solutions. how do we start to set this up? I love these two comics for a couple of reasons. The one on the left, I think, really speaks to much deeper science, actually, than what you tend to get in a comic. When we talk about solutions, if we go really big, it can be a put off. It can really demoralize people. If we say, oh yeah, to solve climate change, we just need to restructure the entire global system of commerce. Okay, I don't think I can get to that in my like 30-minute lunch break that I've got. So I'm just gonna curl up in a ball and cry instead. Like I can't take that on right now. At the same time, if you go too small, people are smart enough to realize there's a disconnect. Hey, you just heard that wildfires are 50% more common now than where they were just 30 years ago. You can help though. Make sure you turn off your light bulbs when you leave the house. Those don't compute either. Like I'm smart enough to realize, yes, turning off light bulbs will help, but it's not going to stop wildfires from happening. We need to go bigger. So let's set people up for success, find that middle ground. And one of the best ways to do that is move from an individual solution to a community level solution. Let's increase the scale and give people a community around them to help mobilize them a little bit. That's going to really get people to that next level. I also feel like I just need to share COVID clearly changed a lot of things about how we view the world. As we think about what comes next, thinking about a way forward rather than a back to normal. Normal wasn't working for a lot of people around the world. How do we think about what we do next, setting everyone up for success? And we actually have specific research and guidelines for how to talk about climate change through COVID. And I can share that information in the chat box or via email afterwards. But what are some of the guidelines? Here, we just kind of break it down a little bit for you. Again, let's instill hope, a sense of agency, efficacy, and moving things in a collective level, because that's going to make it easier for more people to do the right thing. It can be really tough when identifying certain solutions because I may not have the resources to take that action. If what we're telling people to do is all you have to do is install solar on your roof or just go buy a Tesla, that's out of reach for so many people. But if we can find solutions that make sustainable options easier for more people, now more people can join this fight and join this movement towards change. The more specific we can be, the better. A lot of people are kind of just hoping that someone's going to give them the answer. Let's help them with that. It's tough. We don't want to advocate necessarily, and depending on your role, your organization, you might have limitations for what you can say, but the more specific we can be for people, the easier it will be for them to then take that action or learn more. We've got kind of 3 buckets when we think about grouping our solutions. We try and aim people towards either an energy shift or energy efficiency. And that's going to help with reducing or moving away from fossil fuels like coal, oil, and methane gas. Those are really going to then help address carbon dioxide emissions. Our 3rd bucket is talking about it. And I'll acknowledge that may seem like a very different bucket. And it is, but it is equally as important because, again, if you remember at the very beginning, this landscape, so many people care about climate change. They're worried about climate change, but they're not hearing people talk about it. And that's just reinforcing the spiral of silence. And that kind of perpetuates through community groups or politics and community organizations where climate isn't getting the support, the attention, the funding that it might need. So let's empower others to have these conversations because that's going to help all of these other buckets move forward as well. And if we're going to talk about solutions, make it collective rather than individual. Let's not put all the weight on one person's shoulders. Let's make it as local as possible so people can feel like they can get involved in it. The idea of federal policy can sometimes just be too big again. So let's find something local. And let's find something existing. We're not waiting for science to come and save us. Solutions exist today. Let's highlight that because that's going to give people hope even if it's not in their community right now, it's something that they can set up in their community if it isn't there. So what does all this translate to? Brace yourself, one more really bad PowerPoint slide, another couple blocks of text. But let's imagine we've already gotten our value statement about protection, responsible management. We then had kind of our short story of what's at stake here. We talked about the heat trapping blanket. We talked about things like wildfires. Now let's talk about solutions. Oh, I'm so sorry. One extra thing before I get to the terrible slide. We did do some research and we looked at specific word choices as well. What might be more polarizing and off-putting? The same way that we create these values to kind of have a foot in the door. Let's make sure everyone's sharing kind of a common language that's positive. We did find some words starting in 2016 and 2017, not surprising probably, that became very polarizing. We simply recommend avoiding them. The word politician has some dirty connotations at this point. There's a lack of trust. There's all of the drama going on. Just use things like civic or community leaders. Politicians are looped into that, but there's something about some of these words that are really becoming sticky. Policies, laws, regulations, approaches and programs. Again, you can still talk about laws, but being able to highlight it kind of at the beginning as an approach or a program that's going to help seems to be more appeasing to people. And then rather than talking about government as a whole, make it specific. What city, state, municipality are you talking about? And again, that helps bring things back to their locus of control a little bit more than the federal government at large. Obviously, depending on what your solution is, what your work is aiming towards, maybe you're really trying to get legislation passed, this will be a little bit different, but these are just a few little tips from some of our research happening a few years ago. All right, now the bad slide. Here we go. Take just a moment, read through. Again, put in the chat box. Are there things that are really resonating with you, things that you're liking, things that maybe aren't working so well? And I'm happy to take that feedback. For this particular example, I decided to focus on schools. It could be any type of school from grade school up to university, and focused on clean energy. But obviously there are lots of things. And then I threw in future generation of SEALs at the end because I work at a marine mammal hospital. So I always tie things back to both people and SEALs. But take a look through, again, use the chat box. What are things that stand out to you? Do you notice some of these tools being used? Are there things that you see could be beneficial to your work as you move forward following this training? Again, for whatever comes through the chat box, and I'll take a little bit for people to read and jot things down. But Alex or Courtney, if you wouldn't mind just sharing out a couple of the thoughts before we jump into our last thing and wrap up.
I see saving money by doing the right thing.
So kind of co-benefits. Excellent.
Specific names of organizations.
Good.
This is good by involving local groups, reminding people that children are being affected too.
Excellent. So I'll pull out a couple of my annotations, and you caught up on a lot of them. I will point out, reintroducing those values again. The more you can bring those value statements in, the better it will be. If you think about this paired with our other two prompts where we had the value statement and the metaphor statement, we just talked about what's at stake. Wildfires are increasing. They're causing harm and risk to all these groups. Let me bring you back to this centered point where, remember, we all believe in responsible management and protection. So before I talk about a specific solution where things get a little dicier, remember, we're working towards the same thing. Then we want to make sure the solution pairs with what we are talking about here. You don't want to miss any steps in the process. So solar panels, you know, that's actually pretty straightforward for people to understand. Okay, stop using coal, start using solar energy. But if you're going to use a solution maybe around composting, or if you're going to use a solution around, I don't know, even things like heat pumps or other things along those lines, you may need one or two sentences just to help people understand how that actually fits back in, How is me setting up a composting program at my university going to solve reducing fossil fuels like coal, oil, and methane gas? You just need one sentence in there. I always love introducing co-benefits. So many climate solutions are also social justice solutions or economic solutions, or you name it, health issues. Help people realize that the more co-benefits you share, the more sense of relevancy, the more kind of buy-in you might get from people that have strong feelings around some of these things that maybe outweigh the climate side of it, but they really care about maybe the health side of it or the economic side of it or the social justice side of it. And then you pointed out, be specific. If you can name names, do it. Obviously, there are some limitations depending on what your organization allows you to promote. It's not like you're advocating per se in some of these situations. You're just simply making people aware that there are organizations that can support you on this. Find them, learn more about it. And then I do always end with kind of a double solution. Talk about it. Encourage people and prompt them to talk about it so that we can get more people on it. You can't get what you don't ask for. So if we want people to talk more about climate change, tell them to do it. And hopefully these tools allow people that comfort and that sense of understanding that they can parrot back a lot of this information because we use these sticky, memorable notes throughout all of it. All right, so as we wrap up, I know we're running short on time and I want to save time for questions. Here's kind of our toolkit. We've got our values, our metaphors, and our solutions, and we've got additional resources on all of these things. And I'll put some links in the chat box in just a minute if you want to learn more. We have a variety of trainings. We have a free online course that's self-paced that you can take. We also have a 7-week moderated course that we do called the Crash Course, where you get training and coaching and peer mentoring for 7 straight weeks. That we actually just launched registration for. It's going to be closing in a couple weeks, but it's taking place between April and June this year. You can always learn more at climateinterpreter.org/training. And I'll put that link in the box, in the chat box as well. If you want to know more about our work, www.NNOCCI.org. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on Twitter. Again, all of this research, open source. We're happy to share a lot of those resources. The biggest thing I recommend, practice some of these things. For a lot of it, it's like learning a second language. You all know how to talk about climate change. You know the science. These are little tweaks that help make those messages even stronger, is what our research has shown. Try them out, see what works for you. And honestly, with some of those things with the value statements, you can downright plagiarize if you want. We have made that open. If you want to figure out how do I bring responsible management into this website post that I'm making or this tweet, steal that language. You don't need to cite us, just use it. And let's help move the conversation forward. If you have the time, I will put this in the chat box as well. We would love your feedback. We've got just a very short evaluation since we are very much science and research based. We're always trying to improve our work. So I will put that in the chat box shortly. And I want to then stop talking because I've eaten into your question time. I will stop sharing and take questions. Thank you for taking the time. I know this was a lot in a very short period of time, but hopefully it was helpful. And Courtney, Alex, if there are questions that have come in already, please do share. Otherwise, people can put new questions in the chat box or kind of raise your hand and you can come off mute.
Great. I want to say thank you so much. That was really a wonderful presentation that started with just research on perceptions of climate change in North America, this call to normalize conversations and how we talk about climate change, how we can connect to issues and each other. I will say I took the 7-week crash course a couple of years ago, and I think about it and I use it all the time because this framework I can actually tailor to my work and the audiences and the people that I encounter. So I really found it very useful. And there has been some great chat already. I think one question was kind of addressed about the Midwest in particular.
Okay, great.
I guess
Alex,
you
did
can
you?
throw in your opinion on that. So we've talked about, wildfires in California, hurricanes in the Southeast. So what's the Midwest connection to climate change, in your opinion?
There are so many. So the terrible thing about climate change is it affects everything. From a communication standpoint, the good thing about climate change is it affects everything. You can find that connection for people. So obviously drought is a big thing. They're very dense reports, but there are good summaries. Go to the National Climate Assessment, NCA. You should be able just to Google this really easily. They break things down by region and highlight the key climate impact threats moving forward. So you can figure out in the Southeast, all the different flood or heat wave things. In the Midwest, drought, pests is a big one, things along those lines. That is a great resource to look towards.
Great. We also had another question. We always hear about how a lot of the impacts of climate change are being driven by big corporations. So are there ways to instill dialogue, communication about personal change, but also not making it feel like an impossible task on us when really it's corporations that need to change?
Yeah, it's a really tough balance because without a doubt, big business is responsible for the vast majority. I forget the exact stats, but it's something like 20 companies are responsible for like 80% of carbon emissions. So it's really tempting to just go after them. What we've found a little bit is twofold. One is it seems really difficult for people and they kind of start to back away of like, I can't take on ExxonMobil, like just to like name a name, not to throw any particular company under the bus, but like, I don't know how to do that. And therefore I'm not going to do something. Or if I am going to do it, I'm going to sign this letter online and then I'm going to do this and say I've done my piece. So that's where it gets a little bit tough. We want to mobilize people into these community groups because it can help with that social emotional level of, okay, by myself, taking on this oil company seems really big, but with this whole organization behind me, now that seems a little bit more possible. For the individual solutions, there are a lot of things, particularly in the US, that we should be doing to reduce our personal carbon footprints. I don't want people to realize or to think that turning off the light bulbs or me just doing my piece is enough, but I also don't want them to think that they have to do all these things when it's really a much bigger system change. So that's why the community level solutions I think are nice. What can I do that I can scale? So at my home, I can maybe set up a compost garden. That's great. What if I bring that to my school? What if I bring that to my work? What if I talk with the PTA or my kids' soccer team about doing something like that? All of a sudden, we're now able to move from individual to collective. The other thing around collective is this really does help address some of the major inequities that are out there that people just can't take those individual solutions. Stop using your car is not something that you can really talk about to a lot of people. So let's promote safe bike lanes. Let's promote better public transportation, things that can make those resources available to more people is really one great way to move things to address that bigger concept that we need to do of system change.
Thank you. I think we'll take one more question from Dea.
Hi, Adam, great presentation. Thank you so much for sharing all the resources. And it was just overall a really great presentation. You're an excellent communicator. Just, I guess, one thing kind of following up on what you were just saying is that I think like framing is so important. And just thinking about the earlier slides that you had and the topics about how people are talking about climate change, I find it really interesting because a lot of those topics, that is how like climate change was talked about for me in school growing up. But now the conversation, or not the conversation, but now that I know more about climate change, and like I know in the academic spheres is definitely tilted more towards human impacts, extreme weather, and things like that. But I don't know if that is being taught at the lower levels, or how, if that knowledge is being communicated through every level in society. And then another thing related to framing, I think we need to definitely start allowing people to see themselves as climate activists already, especially just thinking about like low income individuals. And for me growing up, like we didn't think about the things that we do as like, you know, helping climate change. But of course we kept all our lights off because, you know, that makes the light bill go up and mama wasn't having that. Or, you know, we are recycling our plastic bags because we use plastic bags for so many other things. You can use a plastic bag for a shower cap or a lunch bag, or, you know, a garbage bag for the bathroom, or like all these different things. And so I think it's also really important that we allow people or help people to see themselves with the actions that they're already doing as climate activists. Because like you were saying, everything, a lot of times these conversations seem so distant and so apart from the, you know, our day-to-day lives. But just kind of thinking about, you know, the way I grew up and how like a lot of those actions were, you know, taking actions against climate change, but nobody ever talked about it that way, or nobody ever framed it that way, or nobody, you know, it was just about the polar bears and recycling plastic bottles, which is still a problem in my childhood household, is the plastic bottles thing. But, you know, that's not really, that doesn't relate to global warming, really. Just
Yeah, amazing points. I second everything you just shared. I've been pleased and hopeful that I have seen some of the conversations shifting, particularly over the last few years. It's not easy. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think it's more people being confident in sharing this and finding those personal stories and sense of connection. And it's building up those community hubs. Who's the right messenger for what audience? I can't go around the country and make people believe that climate change is happening, they should care about it, and they should do XYZ solution. There are so many solutions out there, and so many communities are already doing them. They may not realize the connection to climate. So that's the part about having them see themselves as heroes of their environment, and why I love those co-benefits, because you can do a whole conversation with folks not about climate change, and then you bring in this co-benefit. By the way, did you realize you're making a huge difference? Talk to people about that. You're getting a twofer here. You just don't realize it yet. And then the last piece, I know we're going over, but just to your point around, oh, sorry, and I just lost it. I just lost it. So I will leave it at that then, and I'm sure it will come to me in like 30 minutes once everyone is signed off. But nevertheless, any last questions? I know we're over time. I'll turn it back to Courtney and Alex, though. While they're saying a few last remarks, I'll put my email address and some things in the chat box. So reach out to me if you want some of those additional resources, have additional questions. I'm available, and we've got this entire NNOCCI network as well that can help support you.
Thank you so much, Adam. Yes, like Adam said, if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to him. Thank you so much for attending our seminar. If you would like to learn more about the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center or the Global Change Fellows, you can find us at ccasc.ncsu.edu. Thank you so much.